This is Duke University.
This is Office Hours at Duke University. Today, Professor Nancy MacLean takes your questions about the history behind the political standoff in Wisconsin. MacLean is a professor of history at Duke. She is co-author of Debating the American Conservative Movement, 1945 to the Present. And this semester, she is teaching a graduate course, Post-1945 U.S. History. To ask MacLean a question, send an email to live@duke.edu, tweet with the tag Duke Live, or post to the Duke University Facebook page. You can watch today's discussion again anytime on Duke On Demand.
I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office. I am here with Nancy MacLean. She is Arts and Sciences Professor of History here at Duke. And Professor MacLean, as you know, many eyes are on Wisconsin in this standoff here. Just yesterday, Governor Scott Walker said that he was preparing to issue layoff warnings to about 1,500 public employees. Now, interestingly, though, when you talk about this situation, you don't want to use the term labor dispute. So why is that?
Well, typically a labor dispute is a strike, and so it's a phrase that's applied when workers go out on strike in defense of their rights. This is very different. This is a sitting governor engaged in a political, what people read as a political attack on the rights of labor in his own state and really around the country to take away rights that workers have enjoyed for over 50 years now. So it's a very different situation. It's much more of a political conflict in some ways that is about the rights of labor.
Now, you're a historian, so how do you narrate some of this background, both labor history but also history of the American conservative movement?
Well, really what we're seeing today in Wisconsin is a conflict that goes back to the 1930s, to the last Great Depression that we had when the unions that we know today were beginning to be built up, and when Franklin Roosevelt was in office and inaugurated the policies we've come to know as the New Deal, things like labor's right to organize, Social Security, minimum wages, fair labor standards, minimum and maximum hours, all of those kinds of things. And at that moment in the 1930s, you had a group of business conservatives, people like the DuPont brothers and Albert Sloan from General Motors, who were vehemently against what Roosevelt was doing with the New Deal and began to organize themselves first into a group called the American Liberty League. And if we look back now, we can really see that organizing in the 1930s as the roots of what we're seeing today. So it went on for many years then, over 80 years since then, through many different permutations and different kinds of organizations and other issues added on, some of the social issues we've seen in more recent years. But really throughout this whole 80-year period, the core of the conservative movement has been business conservatives who were against federal regulation of the economy in any way, who were against the rights of workers to organize collectively, to have a shared voice in their conditions of work and their compensation, and basically to eliminate many of the programs that came out of the 1930s on which millions of Americans rely. And that clash was not as visible for many years. In the post-war years, there was kind of relative peace, and the country prospered, and there was, a pretty broad agreement that collective bargaining was in the interests of all Americans and that it was helping workers, it was helping the economy, it was helping the whole society. But since the 1970s in particular, some American businesses have started to organize much more politically, led by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and they have pushed very aggressively for deregulation of the economy, for eliminating rights that workers had enjoyed, and for a variety of other things. So this is really an escalation of that kind of corporate organizing that's been going in earnest since the 1970s, but that really began way back when the New Deal itself was created.
Professor MacLean, we're here at your office hours, and as you know, we're taking questions here. We've got one that's come in by email from Greg, and everybody watching is invited to ask Professor MacLean a question. You can do that by email, by Twitter, or by Facebook. And so Greg says, thanks for holding office hours. He says, I believe that a lot of the contention that exists today around public employee unions today resides in a lack of shared understanding about the purpose of these unions. Private unions exist to protect employees who often have little power against more powerful companies, which one can understand even if you disagree. So the question is, Could you explain why in today's age we need public unions?
Well, the public sector unions began organizing in the 1950s and 1960s, essentially the same time as the civil rights movement, and it really wasn't a coincidence because they were seeking many of the same rights, saying, you know, that if some Americans enjoy certain rights and privileges, why shouldn't others be able to enjoy those rights and privileges? And a really key moment in the development of public sector unions was the Memphis sanitation workers strike of 1968, in which Dr. Martin Luther King came out very vocally in support of the workers there, gave a very impassioned and powerful, I just got chills remembering the speech, saying to a crowd of 10,000 that all labor has dignity, and standing beside these sanitation workers who had suffered horrifically. They actually, it was during the time of Jim Crow and segregation, and the sanitation workers the black sanitation workers were not allowed to have access to the same facilities as the whites in storms and things like that, so they actually had to sit inside the garbage trucks, and somehow in a storm the mechanisms of the compactor got activated, and one of the workers lost their life. It was just a horrible thing, and it set off this organizing in which workers were pushing, above all, their number one demand was for union recognition and the right to bargain. So the questions of, you know, wages, of hours, of conditions, all those other things were secondary to this basic right to be recognized, and King stood beside them. That's where he lost his life, was in standing beside those workers, and so that gave a huge boost to public sector organizing, in which public sector workers were basically saying, you know, we're Americans too. We should enjoy the same rights as other workers, and, you know, we are doing labor that's in the public interest, and we need a voice at work. So that's really how this started. But it was also, again, vehemently opposed by many conservatives at the time, particularly in the 1970s. There were some pitched clashes in the 1970s. So the situation that we're seeing today, again, goes back to that kind of pivotal moment in that 1970s decade.
That's a kind of a civil rights narrative that links the Wisconsin standoff, but I mean, you've probably heard the narrative that goes, this is a democracy story. The citizenry of Wisconsin was sick and tired of budgets and fiscal mismanagement, and so they duly elected the leaders in their state senate and their governor, who pledged to cut budgets and cut costs, and they're doing what they were elected to do. What about that story?
Well, I think what certainly that story is out there, and it's being promoted vigorously in some quarters, but it doesn't actually correspond to what happened in this election. So clearly people were frustrated with the economy. I mean, let's face it, the economy, profits are rising, and, Wall Street is again thriving, but on Main Street, people aren't experiencing that. Unemployment is very high. Many people have taken various kinds of concessions. People are afraid of holding onto their homes. So there was deep anger and frustration about the economy, and a deep feeling, I think, that the Democrats and that the Obama administration had not delivered. So you had what was called, among many, the enthusiasm gap, so that Democratic voters did not turn out in large numbers for this election. So we had an electorate in 2010 that was disproportionately older, that was disproportionately white, and that was disproportionately wealthy. They were the most motivated voters. Even with that, with a kind of skewed electorate, people did not vote for what Governor Walker is now doing. That's contentious.
What's the discrepancy there?
They voted to address the deficit. They had concerns about the deficit. They had concerns about the economy. For some people, it was just a protest vote because they were just so upset about the economy. But many people in Wisconsin are saying they're shocked, and people have gone through and combed over Governor Walker's speeches and his public appearances and his press releases. He never said he was going to take away collective bargaining rights. Nobody voted for that. And what we're seeing now, actually, is a reaction around the country to this. So the latest polls by the New York Times and ABC have shown that 61% of Americans disagree with this effort to take away collective bargaining rights. I believe only it's either 33 or 37% support it. So really, almost 2-to-1 people oppose this effort to take away the existing rights of workers. But even on this question of the compensation of public employees, the latest figures show that 57% of Americans believe that public workers should not have their wages or benefits cut, that they're paid about right. Some people even think that they should be better compensated. So I think what we're seeing in all this is a really growing disconnect between what people are feeling at the community level and around their kitchen tables, and in their neighborhood communities, and what's happening in government. And I think part of the problem with that is that money is playing such a big role in our elections now, and is going to be playing an even bigger role in the wake of the Supreme Court Citizens United decision, but in which powerful investors and various kinds of interests are very well represented in Washington and in our state capitals, and ordinary people are just not finding their voices heard. And that's why I think you see the level of frustration that you see in Wisconsin, but also the very broad base of people coming out in support of these public sector workers. It's really quite stunning when you see, the number of older people, the number who are out there with their children, the number of people whose own jobs are not being affected, the police and firefighters whom Governor Walker exempted from this legislation. All of them are saying this is wrong. This is not the way to go forward and to fix our economy and our society for the future. So he's really tapped something that's very, very powerful in the American people right now, and I think it is because of this disconnect between what people actually want and feel and what's going on in government.
And speaking of making it personal, we've got an interesting comment that's come in by Facebook from Stephanie. And I want to remind viewers that everybody watching can ask Professor MacLean a question. You can do that by email, you can do it by Twitter or by Facebook. And so Stephanie begins by saying that she's a Duke fan, teacher, and Wisconsinite. And she says, teachers are getting a bad rap when you put us all together. Our district has not closed down due to teachers going to protest. We have been open each day, every day, educating our students to the best of our ability, even with all the distractions. I, for one, am sick of being grouped with everyone when I'm doing my job. So what about this issue of the perception of public employees, teachers and others? Who are they? There's obviously a diversity within that broad label, public employees.
Sure. Well, in any of these issues that arise in history or contemporary society where you see a pitched conflict, people tend to group people together. So at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, they would say African Americans want this, or labor movement wants that, or corporations want this. So there's some overlumping, I guess we could say, that happens, or overgeneralizing. So I'm sure not every teacher agrees, or every firefighter, or every conservative. I mean, in the polls I was mentioning before, 40% of Republicans oppose these cuts to public sector wages and conditions and benefits. So point taken. I would never imagine that all teachers agree, but I would say that it's important for teachers to watch what's happening very closely. There was a very powerful article in the New York Times yesterday that really captured this. It was quite poignant, where teachers were saying, where's this scorn coming from? Where's this hatred? I was quoted in an AP article last week, and I happened to scroll down to the comments that readers were putting, and there was some man who was a self-described conservative who was calling teachers scumbags. I mean, he used that language, scumbags, for the people who are teaching our children. And, these are people, I think we all need to kind of step back and take a breath and realize what's going on here. But we're talking about people who are, whatever our differences are about what should be done in the situation, these are people who we used to call public servants. People who chose a career that was focused on helping other people. In this case, and the writer Stephanie is probably doing this because she loves children, and she's really gratified by seeing them develop and grow and thrive and learn. And yet we have a public discourse that's really vilifying teachers, along with other people who have devoted themselves to the public service. And again, I have to say, as a historian who studied the American conservative movement, and I'm currently working on a book on the origins of this push for school vouchers, what I've seen going back to before teachers were even unionized was conservative opposition to public school teachers, because the conservatives saw the teachers as being more liberal than the conservatives thought was appropriate, because the teachers tended to support the New Deal, tended to support Social Security, minimum wages, maximum hours, all those kinds of things. And they were a voice for, in many cases, civil rights protections. And so there was a deep hostility among conservatives to public teachers, even before there were teachers' unions. And so we really need to understand that. And one of the things that's going on now, I think I have to say, frankly, an ugly way, is that some people are making political hay by attacking folks like teachers. You know, the governor of New Jersey has described teachers as the haves, teachers and public sector workers as the haves, and called everybody else the have-nots, and said that, you know, that these public servants are turning other people into serfs. I mean, it's just, you know, at a certain point, you're like, what are we talking about here? It is just so Orwellian. So that's a rather long answer, but what I would say to Stephanie is I absolutely respect the work you're doing, and if you want to continue to do that, just, you know, in your own private way and not be involved with these public protests, that is certainly your right, and we can all respect that. At the same time, I think it is important to pay attention to the level of vitriol that's in these discussions, and to wonder why it is that people who are doing public service, who are helping children, old people, you know, this is being directed at hospital workers, school crossing guards, police, firefighters. What is going on here, and where is it coming from? And I think when you do follow, again, as the journalists say, follow the money trail, it goes back to these very well-funded conservative think tanks, the American Enterprise Institute, Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, a number of these groups in Washington, and a number of the organizations like Americans for Prosperity that's been funded by the Koch brothers, who have invested hugely in all of this. They put $40 million into the last election. So, so there's a pretty powerful and well-funded echo chamber out there that is fueling these attacks on public workers, and I think we all need to be mindful of that.
And to pick up on that, and following the money trail, I mean, obviously, the Democratic Party receives money too, and some funders, I mean, George Soros is sort of famous for funding more liberal causes, and unions, you know, collect dues, and so over a wide range of people, they end up with funding for lobbying. Is there a follow the money trail story on the other side?
Absolutely, and it's a really good point that you make to bring that up. Yes, if you look at the 10 largest contributors in the last election round, 7 of them were corporate, 3 were unions, and so yes, unions are very big players in American politics, and they have been for some time. So they're really the main institutional base of the Democratic Party in the kind of get out the vote sense and in contributions. So some people, a number of political scientists in particular, and journalists, are also reading what Governor Walker is doing and what is happening now in other states as a very partisan move to basically take away from the table those important Democratic contributors and make it so that they cannot play that role, in which case the 10 largest donors would all be representing corporate interests. So, so yes, there are unions who mobilize politically and who contribute money. On the other hand, I think we also have to say, why do they do this? You know, and what role do both of these forces play? And if you look at American political life over, again, the years since the 1930s, unions have been the #1 most important voice in American politics for the interests of lower income Americans of all descriptions, working class and middle class people. They have, well, first of all, they brought us the 40-hour week, the weekend, as the, you know, one bumper sticker I've seen puts it. They brought us, they lifted the floor under all workers.
Minimum wage.
Yeah, so many economists who have studied this have found that even workers who aren't represented by unions have their conditions and wages lifted up by employers' realization that if they don't provide better wages and conditions, workers will look to unions. They've also provided grievance mechanisms and things like that. But in politics, they've really been the only institutional force that we have that represents the interests of non-elite Americans in Washington and at the level of state capitals. And so if they are removed from the political equation, we are going to see just an extraordinary domination of our politics by corporate interests, which has been growing over the years, but will become much more pronounced in this situation. So we're really talking about pretty high-stakes stuff here.
Right, and so you're talking about the importance of civil discourse and not using the Orwellian language. I want to take an interesting example here. So Mark has weighed in on Facebook and kind of went back and forth with Stephanie, if we could interrupt their conversation. Sure. And I'm guessing you're not sympathetic. He says, Wisconsin, I support your governor and believe public employee unions should be abolished. I am deeply offended by the actions of the union teachers in Wisconsin. Real change is coming in 2012. Bye-bye Obama and the Socialist Democrats. So you've actually have quite a bit of practice being in conversation with conservative colleagues. You were on the radio earlier this week from a gentleman from Cato Institute. You have a book about the American conservative movement with a more conservative colleague. So where's that common ground if you were to start a civil conversation with Mark where you might not agree on everything but find some common ground?
Well, I don't know that we necessarily have to find common ground. I think what's most important, what my co-author in the Debating the American Conservative Movement book and Donald Critchlow, what we wanted to do was model for our students and really for the wider polity a way of talking about in debating issues in our public life that was serious and was hard debate, but that also was respectful and that didn't engage in the kind of character assassination that we see so much in American life now, or the deception. You know, I mean, there's a whole industry in our talk show world now and the radio of really coming up with scurrilous charges about other people, of ad hominem attacks, of distorting people's histories and records in a way that really smacks of the kind of McCarthyism of the 1950s that we used to think was history. So we really didn't want to do that. But that said, we recognize that there were real differences, you know, in terms of what our basic values are, what we think would be a good America, what we think most people want to see. So I guess, I mean, the way I would think about that in just laying out my cards is I believe, and I believe that the history of the 19th and 20th century shows us that we all do best when we show some regard for one another, that Americans really value opportunity, and that's part of what has made our society so dynamic and great and so attractive to immigrants for so long. But opportunity only exists when people can count on some basic level of economic security. People are very reluctant to take advantage of opportunities that might be out there if they think that that's going to, you know, essentially put them in the poorhouse. And so that's one of the things that's happening now because people, you know, well, before the healthcare legislation was passed, you know, if you couldn't leave your job, if you had a pre-existing condition, then you couldn't take advantage of a good job elsewhere. You know, you couldn't invest in education if you weren't sure that it would bring rewards. So this country, in our period of greatest growth, in the time when we were most thriving in our history, which was the post-war period, the post-World War II period, was also the time when our country was fairest, when we had actually the highest levels of progressive taxation. We had over 70% marginal tax rates on highest incomes. We had a broadly recognized right to organize for working people. We believed in voice, that people should have a right to democratic representation, not only at the ballot box every 2 years, but also in their day-to-day conditions, which is basically what unions are. They let people exercise some right of democracy where they work. So going back to your caller's question, I think we just see the world in different ways. You know, I mean, he's talking about Obama, you know, getting rid of Obama and the socialist revolution. And, you know, again, this goes way back to the 1930s. The American Liberty League that I mentioned before, which was this business conservatives organization, described Social Security and the rest of the Roosevelt agenda as socialism. And many conservatives and economic libertarians over the years have called Social Security, which is our most popular government program from which most Americans, just about all Americans at this point benefit, and which most of us really want to strengthen, not weaken. These conservatives and these economic libertarians have called that socialism and wanted to eliminate that. They want to privatize that. That's the agenda that Cato Institute and a number of these other conservative foundations are promoting. So I think that I keep thinking caller, but it's not a caller, but
Poster.
the person who's
Mark
writing
on Facebook.
in, I think Mark probably just has a really different vision of what a good America is from me, and I think from most Americans, judging from what we're seeing in the poll data, judging from, you know, the ways Americans have voted over the years, Americans really value these programs that provide us some security in order to take advantage of opportunity, and that recognize that we all thrive most when we look out for each other to some degree, when we have some kind of a floor underneath us so that people can't lose everything when they have a health emergency or whatnot. So that's the kind of America I'd like to see, and I think the historical record shows that our country has thrived most when we acted in that way.
Good. We've got another question that's come in here by email from Victor. I think he wants to take us in a kind of international direction. He says, the right to collective bargain is recognized through international human rights conventions. Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights identifies the ability to organize trade unions as a fundamental human right. Why do you think it is that this fact is never surfaced in national media coverage of the Wisconsin story?
That is a hugely important point, and I really appreciate the caller pointing this out. Yes, the rights of public sector workers are under attack right now in Wisconsin, but the truth is private sector workers have had their rights to organize attacked quite aggressively over the last about 40 years. I mean, going back a little further too, but certainly in the last 40 years, such that Human Rights Watch, which most of us associate with, exposing dictators like Gaddafi or Robert Mugabe or some of these other folks around the world. But Human Rights Watch cited the United States in 2009, for violating American workers' basic human right to organize. So the person who wrote, Greg was his name?
So Victor was
Victor,
the most
I'm
recent.
sorry.
Yeah, Greg was
Victor,
earlier.
you are absolutely right. On a world scale, the right to organize and bargain and come together in trade unions is recognized as a right of free association and of collective voice that is vital to human rights and democracy, and it is systematically being violated now in the private sector for reasons we can go into if you're interested. If not, I'll leave it there. But what's happening now is that the employers who have helped to undermine the right to bargain in the private sector are now trying to take that right away from public sector workers who have been lifting up conditions as private sector conditions have been pulled down.
We've got another question here that's come in from Deanne by email, and we've got more than 100 people participating in office hours here. And I want to remind everybody watching that you can ask Professor MacLean a question by email, by Twitter, or by Facebook. So Deanne is talking about the media. The media simply will not talk about this corporate involvement in Wisconsin. They completely ignore it. Who owns the media? Large multinational corporations. This gets back to the fact that people really need to be concerned is big corporations, not big government, not big unions. Fear-mongering is being presented. Says, I don't really have a question, but I want you to speak about this. So when you're reading the newspaper, are you feeling that the corporations aren't being identified, their role in the standoff?
I think that she's absolutely right. I think we have a deep problem in our media now. If you go back 40 or 50 years, just about every city newspaper in the country had a labor reporter, a person who had the labor beat and who addressed economic issues, but kind of from the perspective of representing the interests of ordinary people. Right now, I believe we have one left. Stephen Greenhouse for the New York Times is the only one. There might be another in California, I think, but it's it's ridiculous. I mean, it's less than a handful. So newspaper, and we've had huge changes in the way that our media are organized, in the ways that papers report. So she's absolutely right that there's a basic problem here. Another thing that we've seen is that conservative movements, and I give them a lot of credit for this. I mean, I think when I study social movements, and I include the conservative movement among them, I study organizing and how people get their grievances recognized as public issues and how they take action and how they shape a message and all of that. And conservatives have been very, very effective at creating their own credentialing outfits. So if you look at, again, the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, all of these institutions are shaping a message that goes into public life. But when they are quoted in the newspaper, they're just represented as, the American Enterprise Institute said this, or Cato said that, and nobody actually digs in to say, well, where does their funding come from? What else do they stand for, et cetera? So I think our media really need to do a better job of doing their homework and figuring out, when you are quoting and, citing and putting people on the air, let your readers know what they stand for. Let us know the rest of their values. Let us know something about their vision for the country. Let us know how they pay the salaries of the people who are shaping their messages. All of that, I think, is vital for people to know. So I think she's absolutely right. And the latest kind of case in point of this is the Koch brothers, who have been huge funders of this group called Americans for Prosperity, which is behind this agenda that is going out, through the different states. They also invested a lot in the North Carolina elections, where we're doing this show, and they stand to benefit from the kinds of changes that these Republican governors are putting through. To just give you one example of that, Governor Walker is not only trying to eliminate collective bargaining in the bill that he's proposed. It's a 144-page bill, and there's all kinds of little time bombs planted in there. One of them allows the governor pretty much at will to privatize public utilities without bids, without a public hearing process, to just decide that he personally thinks it's in the interest of the state to privatize these utilities and sell them to other people. Well, guess what? Koch brothers has huge interest in utilities, so they really stand to benefit from this. So I think that as Stephanie pointed out, we really need to be paying attention to this whole spectrum of issues that are coming together in Wisconsin. It is not just about the right to bargain. It is about what kind of government we're going to have for the next generation or two of American life. And it is about whether we are going to maintain things like transparency, public hearing processes, democratic accountability, all those things that Americans have come to deeply value and that we've told the rest of the world we stand behind. Those kinds of practices and values are really under threat right now, and I think it's very, very important that we all start paying close attention and see whether we like those changes. And if we don't like those changes, then we're citizens. We have the capacity to use our voices, to activate the networks that we're part of, and we should be heard, because our society, I believe, as a historian, our society and our politics are being fundamentally changed at this moment, and most citizens are not paying very close attention, and I think we're going to really regret that 10 years down the road.
And we've had an email from Steve D, who heard your Bloomberg radio interview and is cheering you on in his vein of sort of a role of corporations. And he was a New York State public employee and gave us a lot of background. But he comes up and says, as the Wall Street evil empire will try to attain their borderless society and global business environment, even if it kills the United States and its people, which centered around the middle class that made this country the best in the world. National conglomerates are destroying us. So I think he's echoing a lot of what you've been saying. But I mean, there must be some limits. I mean, what's the proper role of corporations? You know, we drive cars made by corporations. We're on cameras made by corporations. So, I mean, is there a limit to the kind of, you know, calling Wall Street evil empire? What's the positive role of corporations?
Well, he sounds like he's very concerned. And, you know, you have to, I mean, we have forgotten, there's been so much focus on public employees and so much talk about, you know, them causing trouble over the last month or so. We seem to have forgotten how this economic crisis was created. But in 2008, the world, 2007, 2008, the world economy almost tanked because of the banks, Wall Street investors, and deregulation that enabled them to basically act with impunity and create all kinds of shady and problematic practices for which the rest of us have paid trillions of dollars. I mean, just about everybody I know, and I'm in a pretty comfortable position economically, has faced drastic drops in the values of their houses, has seen cuts in their rate of pay, has been asked to pay more for their health insurance and, other kinds of insurance. So we're all paying for that crisis that Wall Street brought on. And we just saw at the Academy Awards, the Best Documentary prize went to the producers of a fabulous but quite chilling film called Inside Job, about this Wall Street, the Wall Street, whatever you want to call them, shenanigans that kind of brought down our economy. And when the director of the film went up to accept the prize, he reminded the audience that no one has faced any kind of criminal charges, any kind of prosecution on Wall Street. There's been absolutely no accountability for the biggest disaster in our economic history brought on by bad practices on Wall Street and among the banks. And so I understand why why the letter writer might be unnerved. Now, you know, that said, you know, of course, I mean, corporations have created some things that we absolutely value. I mean, have a good car. I like my car. You know, we're sitting in a place that has, you know, good furniture and working computers. So that's fine. But I think we need to get back to a situation in which corporations produced goods and services and competed in a fair and reasonable way, in which there was some attention to the long term rather than what we have now, which is Wall Street basically pushing corporations, you know, through investor power to drive conditions down further and further and further in this kind of race to the bottom. And we need to get that kind of money out of our politics. I mean, we are fast returning to a situation that is like the period that Mark Twain famously called the Gilded Age, the period in the late 19th century after the end of Reconstruction, before the Progressive Era, when our politics were basically sold to the highest bidder, when very wealthy corporations, the railroad corporations, people you remember from high school as robber barons, those people had extraordinary power over our politics. I mean, they talked about the Senate as a place where, you know, votes were bought and sold and haggled over, you know, the highest bidder and things like that. And we, at least I, do not want to return to that situation. So I think we need to really address these big issues of campaign finance is a huge one, and of the use of the great resources and profits that corporations are taking in, not to invest and produce better products, but to skew our tax system, to skew our regulatory system, and so forth. So,
I guess there's some line there with money in politics, and I know again you were on the radio with a gentleman from the Cato Institute, and he said, sure, people give us money who agree with us, and then we you know develop our research, and that's what you can do as a citizen of the United States. If David and Charles Koch want to take their money and buy campaign slogans and posters and ad time, you know, who is the government to say no, you can't use your own money in the political process? You know, so what about this again, the story that says America is the land of the free, and if you free enterprise, and then you freely take your money and use it in politics? I mean, how do you respond when you hear that story?
well, I certainly know that that story is out there. I think for most of us, it's almost funny to say that my capacity as a citizen, you know, and again, I'm, you know, pretty comfortable compared to what a lot of Americans are experiencing right now. But to say that even, you know, that my capacity as a citizen in any way matches something like the Koch brothers. I mean, people who had $40 million to put into elections, and, you know, one of them sits on the board of the Cato Institute, and the Cato Institute helps shape policy, which is supportive of those interests. So they're investing well. I think, you know, the people who have the resources like that to invest in politics are certainly seeing return on investment. But I don't think that notion, I think that almost shows what's so ridiculous about the notions of individualism circulating in American life right now, because if we say that I and the person next to me are, as citizens, have the same right to get involved in politics and to contribute to campaigns, and it just happens that the person standing next to me is Mayor Bloomberg in New York, who I just read the other day, is starting to hire people at $500,000 a year jobs to spread his political message and his policies in the media. So I don't know about you, and I don't know about the people watching the show, but I don't think that I have an equal say with Mayor Bloomberg to get, an equal way to get my views out there. So again, I think this takes us back to why it is that faced with this kind of situation in the late 19th century, Americans began to organize unions and began to organize, community institutions that could better represent them collectively than they could represent themselves individually, because they could see that that was a fiction and it's a fraud. You know, the ordinary citizen does not have the money of the Koch brothers to make our voices heard. So the only way we will be heard is if we come together in bodies like trade unions or, which are the most powerful voices, but other kinds of community organizations and good government organizations to try to get some sane rules back in our political life.
And you're a historian, and so, of course, you look to the past for examples for the future. And I think an interesting example you've written about is Frances Perkins, Labor Secretary under FDR. And so why do you think she holds symbolism and lessons for us today?
Well, Frances Perkins was very important as a figure in American life who actually came out of, deep faith tradition.
Okay.
She's a woman of very, very deep faith. She would actually go to a convent once a month just for a day of quiet reflection to keep her self-centered and to keep her values in order while she was doing this important public work. But she also came out of the a whole flourishing of reform among women at the turn of the century, much of which was focused on conditions of labor, on consumer rights, on all kinds of things in the public interest. So she very much came out of that world and did some very, very important things in the Department of Labor, was really a voice for ordinary Americans. She actually said at one point, I came to Washington to work for God, the American workers, and FDR, or something like that. So she really had this great sense of mission, and she made the Department of Labor into a vital agency for America's working people to really try to respect their basic rights, to honor their dignity, to make sure that they had fair treatment, to make sure that they weren't subject to abuses, to make sure that children weren't working. I mean, we have to remember we had child labor in this country, so these kinds of labor organizing efforts and government regulations were also what ended child labor and practices like that. But anyway, so she was a really important public figure, and there are other people today who are working within her tradition. There's a really interesting figure back in Chicago, where I came from, named Kim Bobo, who organized a national organization called Interfaith Worker Justice, and they bring together clergy and laity across denominations to shine a bright light on these issues of abuses of workers. One particular issue they've taken up is wage theft. We don't realize it because, again, the media doesn't always report these things, but by using Department of Labor statistics and really good research by economists, they've found that millions of workers are suffering wage theft every year, and they are losing literally billions of dollars from this practice of wage theft. Bobo wrote a very good book about it that was leading to some legislation before this round of elections. But anyway, so there's a deep, deep tradition in American life of people who have been motivated by their faith traditions to seek justice, and by their sense of deep concern and compassion for their fellow citizens to try to make this a better country. And their efforts really have had that effect over years, but a lot of what they achieved is vulnerable now.
Are you hearing those voices from the church, from the Jewish community in today's standoff?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I just saw, in fact, a report the other day that a large group of clergy from all over southeastern Wisconsin, Catholic priests, Protestant ministers, rabbis, I think some imams, had gone with this group, Interfaith Worker Justice, to the Capitol in Wisconsin and marched in saying, this is what religion looks like, and so they're really lifting up the justice-seeking religious tradition that was such an important part of the New Deal. We've sort of forgotten about this, but this goes way back to the social gospel at the turn of the century, to deep Jewish justice-seeking traditions. There are deep strains of, sort of compassion. Again, we get a certain image of Islam, but it's, very different. And there's such an emphasis on, charity, on compassion, and things like that. So there are groups who are really trying to bring these values back to the table and bring us all back to at least what I would consider some of our best traditions, but they don't always get the coverage that some of the shouting religious people do. But even there, I have to say, as someone who studies the conservative movement, again, as well as civil rights and labor and the women's movement, one of the things that I've been struck by in the archives and the research for my current book is that conservatives were deeply unsettled by that religious justice-seeking tradition at mid-century. These were the groups that, again, across faith traditions that supported the New Deal, that supported the rights of labor unions, defended Social Security, et cetera, and that also played a key role in passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I have found in the archives conservatives being deeply agitated about that tradition and angry that, for example, Catholic priests, were standing with farm workers or doing these things. So they very self-consciously set out to create a counter tradition, to lift up religious figures like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and a lot of these other people who would take attention away from those social justice issues and put them more on what they called the salvational gospel, but that also over time became very, very important bases for the Republican Party. So the religious right that we've come to know is not an accidental or spontaneous creation, but you can actually go back to the archives and see the strategic investments and the vision that was put into lifting up this voice precisely to drown out that religious justice-seeking voice that had been so important at mid-century.
Professor MacLean, we've covered a lot of territory here. So, so you're a professor. In closing out, what about a homework assignment? You know, either a book to check out from the library or something to Google to look up online. The background for what's going on in Wisconsin now.
Well, that's an interesting question. Historians tend to think in huge bibliographies, so I won't do that to you. And in fact, I won't even recommend a book by a historian. I think a book that Americans really need to read today, actually two, both by Jacob Hacker, whom I've never met, who is a political scientist at Yale. And he did a book probably about 10 years back called The Great Risk Shift that showed that what has really happened that's been so devastating in recent years that we haven't focused much attention on is that ordinary Americans now are being made to shoulder levels of risk that they did not have to face for almost a half a century. So all of these things, you know, the way that retirement, you know, there used to be defined benefit retirement plans, health care, just everything is, if people feel stressed out, there's a good reason for it. And this book tells you a lot about it, how it got to be that way. And then he's also, with a co-author, Paul Pearson, written a book called Winner Take All Politics, which shows the effect that this money and, you know, these kind of changes in our compensation and taxation systems, the effect that they're having on our politics. So I think those are really vital reading to make sense of what's going on in this fight in Wisconsin, what's at stake, but also what we need to be thinking about as we go forward into the next generation, because we have pressing questions before us of what kind of world our children and grandchildren are going to inherit, and if we don't focus on them now, we may lose the moment. It's that urgent and it's that serious. So I urge people to sit up and take notice, and there's an old expression that says, which side are you on? Figure out what you think, and know that this is a moment when we can all make a difference and we need to be heard.
Professor MacLean, thank you for holding these online office hours.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Nancy MacLean is Arts and Sciences Professor of History here at Duke. A recording of this office hours conversation will be available on the Duke On Demand website. That's ondemand.duke.edu.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.